course, first of all, I would like to thank the organizers. This has been, a lovely reunion and event. I know many of the people that were here before, but I got to also meet a number of new other people. So my name is Cesar A Hidalgo. I run the collective learning group at the MIT Media Lab, and what we do in my group is two things. On the one hand, we try to understand how teams, cities, organizations, and nations learn, and on the other hand, we develop tools to help facilitate that learning. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to do three things. The first one is I'm going to go a little bit over the literature that we have developed over the last 100 years to tell you about some of the laws or the things that we're a little bit more sure about now that relate to processes of collective learning. The second thing that I'm going to do is then I'm going to show you some new research that we have been doing in this area that actually tries to look at the vectors of learning, which is something that we have not been able to look at before. And finally, I'm going to show some of the software tools that we created to visualize and integrate vast amounts of data in the context of providing better tools for governments. So the story starts in 1916 when Leon Thurston had a great idea. He was an electrical engineer, but at that time, he was starting to work as a psychologist, and he realized that there had been recently a course on typewriting that gave him the opportunity to measure how people learn. So Thurston got all of that data on that typewriting course and started to measure how well people did each week as they practiced more and more. And he realized that people started typing faster and they started to make less errors as they practiced more. And that Thurston's first paper is the one that documents for the first time this idea of a learning curve. So that was a long time ago, was during the time of the First World War. And it related to individuals. In this case, were individuals that were typing and they were getting more proficient at the task, the more experience they gained. But since then, Theodore Wright, which is also the brother of the famous biologist Sewell Wright, took these ideas into the realm of collective learning by studying how people assembled planes. So this study that was done during the 1930s. There were many teams that were assembling planes, and he looked at what was the cost in terms of the labor that needed to go into producing those planes that these firms had to put into the production of those planes, the more planes they produce. And what he learned is that actually the more planes these firms produce, the less man-hours they needed to produce each plane. And this eventually was not scale economies. It wasn't that they were producing more planes. It was the same team with the same capital. It wasn't about any of these other factors. So since then, there was a large literature that emerged that documented these learning curves. And apparently what must have been happening here is that these teams were gaining some experience or some knowledge that was being accumulated with these tasks. Maybe the most famous example of this type of improvement curves is, of course, Merck's curve, which does not apply to a team or to an individual, but more to the improvement rate of an industry. So that brings us to what I would say is a very well-established fact, which is what I call, the first law of collective learning. We can say that this is the Thurston-Wright-Moore's law, and it's the idea that the unit cost of performing an activity decreases concavely, with cumulative experience. Now, cumulative experience naively is measured as the total output that you have produced. Technically, some people, then measure it as an integral of that total output discounted by how long ago you did each unit of output, and that tends to produce better outcomes. But for the qualitative message, the idea is that the more you do something, the less it costs you to do it, or the less errors you introduce. The thing is, we don't only learn how to do the same things that we already know, but better. We often need to learn to know how to do new things. So we can improve, by following one of the learning curves that were discovered by Thurston, Wright, and Moore. And we can also figure out how to do new things, which might involve us accumulating knowledge that we do not have about things that we did not know anything about. So here you see the evolution of the productive structure of Korea between 1962 and 2015, and you see that Korea learned how to do many things that they did not know how to do before. So there must be a different process at play or a second law at play, one that is not about learning in the context of improvement, but learning in the context of figuring out how to do something that you did not know how to do. And economists learn how to do many things. They learn how to develop new products, new research areas, new industries, new occupations, new skills and whatnot. Now, if we're going to discuss learning in the context of collective phenomena, we have to be able to separate between what would be the hypothesis that we would observe if learning was not collective and if learning was collective. So think of a world in which you are trying to learn a musical instrument. You're trying to learn how to play the piano. So there is one world in which the probability of learning how to play the piano does not depend on knowing other people or being in contact with other people that know how to play the piano or that are good musicians. So in that case, your probability of being successful, your probability of learning that activity is going to be flat, whether you have a few neighbors that know how to perform that activity or whether you have many. Okay? But there is another world in which you are more likely to succeed in that learning task if you have more neighbors that are actually proficient in the task that you want to learn. So you would have a world in which when nobody knows how to play the piano, it's very hard for you to succeed and learn. But when many people know how to play the piano, you are actually going to be much more likely to become a good piano player. And of course, that growth could be proportional to the number of neighbors. So you double the neighbors, you double how likely are you going to be to succeed. Or it could be that the neighbors actually reinforce each other, because there's some knowledge or some skills that actually are complementary that they bring. Or there are cases in which this could be sublinear, meaning that the neighbors don't reinforce each other, but they provide redundant knowledge. So having that second or third or fourth teacher doesn't matter anymore. So that's what we're going to try to test. Now, who are the neighbors? Where do we get the knowledge from? On the one hand, you have geographic neighbors. And on the other hand, you're going to have neighbors in the context of relatedness, people that do similar things than the ones that you want to learn. So the idea of geographic neighbors is an old idea. I think the foundational paper here, is Jaffe and Trachtenberg. They look at patents and citations, and they found that most of those citations tend to be spatially localized. And basically, they argue that by looking at comparable papers and looking at the localization of those citations, that knowledge spillovers tend to be local. So when people produce knowledge, that knowledge doesn't travel everywhere in the world, but actually tends to fall, within a few blocks or a few kilometers away from them. Then people like Stefano Brecci and Lisoni and Zing, they show that actually a lot of that localization of knowledge was not because geography mattered in the terms of the cost of transportation or travel time, but it was because social networks themselves were localized. So once you introduce information on who these inventors have collaborated with before, you could explain most of the localization of knowledge. So in some sense, geography matter, not because mountains matter, but geography matter because social networks tend to be spatially circumscribed. And since then, we have started looking at other ideas that actually show us that these spillovers also go into the neighbors. So for instance, with Danny Bahar, we did a paper in which we showed that the probability that a country starts exporting a product increases when they have a neighbor that is exporting the same product. And that's something that also has been reproduced in other settings. The probability that an industry would develop in a certain region or province in a certain part of the world increases when you have a neighboring region or province that is already good at that industry. And that's interesting because traditional trade theory tells us that when you are close to someone that is good at something, you should do something else. And what we're finding here is that maybe, competition is not this main driving force here, but what you have is another force that counterbalances this, which is the force of learning. So sometimes you want to do what your neighbor is doing, because actually the benefits that you get from learning from your neighbor might be larger than the cost that you get from competing from your neighbor. Now, when we look at related activities, this is the story of the product space. I'm going to go very quickly because many of you know this story. But in this network, each node represents a product, and products are connected if they're likely to be co-exported. So it's a network of related economic activities. And the dots that are painted are the dots that Chile exported in 1979 or 1996. And what we're predicting here, we're saying if learning is collective, the probability that Chile develop a new export activity is going to be correlated with the previous export activities and how related they are. So the dots that should appear should be dots that are neighbors, of the products that Chile was already exporting. And that is what we find. The thing is, this is something that has been found to be true in many settings. So it's true for countries and products that we show in that science paper in 2007. It's true for research areas, so the probability that a scholar would enter a research area, that a university would enter a research area, meaning that they start publishing and they have comparative advantage in that research area, or that a country enters a research area also increases with the number of related activities. It's true for patents too, that has been shown in a variety of cities and countries, and it's true for industries, and that has been shown for Brazil, for Sweden, for China, with very different data sets, and these are very different institutional regimes, and it works at very different spatial scales. So what we're saying with a large group of colleagues here is that we're in the presence of a second principle or a second empirical law, and it's what we call the principle of relatedness. And this tells us that the probability of entering or exiting an economic activity, where this economic activity is a product, an industry, a research area, increases with the physical proximity to related knowledge, usually in the form of a power, Now, this principle of relatedness is not about entry, it's also about exit. I always find talking about exit is a little bit more boring, but it works there as well. So now we know that we're on the right-hand side of this chart. When we're thinking about new economic activities, basically the probability that we would succeed at them depends not on how much knowledge we have. This is not an agglomeration economic story. This is not about a human capital story, but on how much related knowledge we have in that location, Knowledge that is similar to the one of the activity that we're going to enter. So New York might have a lot of knowledge, but the knowledge might be very different than the knowledge that is available in LA, and therefore the industries that are going to enter are going to be different, not because one is more knowledgeable than the other, but because of this relatedness component. But we don't know whether we are in the top curve, the central curve, or the bottom curve. Is this knowledge redundant, or are these neighbors reinforcing each other? When we look at the research space and the product space, we find that the effect is slightly superlinear. So the larger the number of related activities that I have present in a location, the more likely I'm going to be able to enter one of those activities. Also, the effects note that are quite big when you are trying to enter an export of a product that is not surrounded by related economic activities, your probability of entering in single digits is less than 0.1%, But once you have all of the related activities developed, your probability of entering that activity is around 16%. The same is true. It's a big size effect for research areas as well. Now you might ask yourself, what if I have both? I have related economic activities and I have good geographic neighbors, So I'm a location that has a lot of related knowledge, but also is neighbor to another location where those industries are already present. Do I become a super learner when I combine these two channels? And the answer is not. In that case, those two channels exhibit diminishing returns. So one way to look at this chart is before we're looking at these bar charts. So these bar charts would be just like looking at this or that axis, just at the margin. But when I have both neighboring provinces and active related industries, as I have one, adding the other one doesn't cause any increase anymore. There are diminishing returns. In the regression language, that goes as a negative interaction term. So basically what it means is that these two channels of learning are substitutes. I have related activities, I can learn from them. I can have neighbors that I can learn from them. But if I have one, I don't that much need the other. And this is something that also has been reproduced for data for a number of countries. Now, the third principle is one that relates to knowledge intensity. So far, we have been talking about learning how to do the same activities but better. We're talking about the probability that you enter or exit a certain activity. But now, we want to try to measure the knowledge intensity that exists in an economy or that is related to an activity to try to see if there are some consequences to having activities that are more or less knowledge intense. Now, what we don't want to do is we don't want to think of knowledge in these terms. We don't want to think of knowledge as some sort of quantity that increases, and that we can accumulate as some sort of substance. That is like the wrong way to think about it, because knowledge actually can be specific in many different ways. And then we're going to go into examples in which we're going to measure this specific knowledge. So what we want to think of knowledge is more in this way, in which actually knowledge tends to be specific to certain activities and is partly overlapping to others. So someone that knows how to drive a bus, might have much of the knowledge that you need to drive a school bus, but it might be missing some knowledge about understanding the regulations, that you have to do when you're carrying children instead of carrying, regular passengers, And those regulations might be quite different than the ones that you need to transport freight, But the guy that transports freight might know something about customs and how to clear them that might be similar to the knowledge that is known to the guy that operates a crane, although that overlap might be very small. So you have to think of knowledge, in this context that is very specific. It is diverse and is partly overlapping. So it's like different pieces, of a puzzle which are partly substitutable. It's not something that increases as a substance. You just not simply accumulate more and more. And there's a lot of literature, of course, that have tried to quantify knowledge. In the 90s, this idea of the knowledge-based economy was very big. There's many books and papers. Lud Leidensdorf is one of the big people on that literature from the 90s. But the standard approach that they used to try to measure knowledge intensity more or less was the following. They assume that economies have knowledge, so far, so good. And they assume that that knowledge gets expressed in activities. So I know that you have knowledge, on agriculture if you export pears and apples and figs and so forth. But then what they did to measure knowledge is they assumed that some of these activities were knowledge intense and some of these activities were not knowledge intense. So they would classify them. Okay, so they would say, no, software development is a knowledge intense activity. Fig farming is not a knowledge intense activity. So what we're going to do is we're going to count the number of software developers in your country as a way to try to understand the knowledge intensity or the human capital intensity in the older language of your country. Okay? Now, what we've done is something a little bit different. We say, well, economies have knowledge, the knowledge against different activities, but a priori, we don't know which activities are knowledge intense or not. So the trick here is the following. We say knowledge intense economies are those involving knowledge intense activities. And we say that knowledge intense activities are those performed by knowledge intense economies. So of course, if you put this into an Excel sheet, what happens? It goes bananas, it tells circular reference. Huh? But what we're saying is that the knowledge intensity of an economy is equal to the average knowledge intensity of the activities. The knowledge intensity of an activity is equal to the average knowledge intensity of those economies. Okay? So now I put this one there, and I have an eigenvalue problem. So Kc is an eigenvector of this large matrix. So I actually have a measure of knowledge intensity that I can derive. The good news is that this measure tells us two things. The first one, of course, is highly correlated with GDP per capita, but that's not that interesting because correlating with GDP is very easy. What is interesting is that the economies that have a knowledge intensity that is too large given their income, for example, this chart here is for 1985, tend to grow much faster. Okay? So what we have is a method that is actually highly predictive of long-term future economic growth because economies tend to converge to a level of income that is compatible with the knowledge intensity. This is something that is extremely robust to controlling to a large number of metrics, measures on institutions, on human capital, on competitiveness, and so forth. I don't want to bore you with all of the different controls because I think it goes beyond the message, but it's a very robust and has been reproduced by a large number of researchers by now. The other thing is also economies that are more knowledge intense tend to be less unequal. So here you have the income inequality of countries. Here you have the economic complexity index, which is our measure of knowledge intensity. And here you have Malaysia and Chile. And I chose those two countries to highlight because Chile and Malaysia have the same level of income, the same average years of schooling, but they have very different productive structures. Chile is a very extractive economy, focused on the exports of copper, of fish, of wood products. Malaysia is a very manufacturing-based economy. So it illustrates that more manufacturing-based economies actually that are more knowledge-intense tend to have lower levels of income inequality. Whereas the United States, which is so unequal, is actually not that far. It's right there. It's not that big of an outlier. But of course, if you live your life comparing the United States to Sweden and Denmark, you're always going to think that it's a very unequal place. But the world is a little bit larger than the US and Scandinavia. So there you find actually quite robust relationship between the levels of income inequality, not wealth inequality, and economic complexity. So knowledge-intense economies and knowledge-intense activities are actually associated with higher levels of income. What we're buying in the economy is that unit of knowledge, and when that unit of knowledge is very cheap, it tends to grow faster. The story of China is growing is not the story of cheap labor. Ethiopia has 80 million people at much lower salaries than China. It's a story of a high level of complexity and knowledge in that economy, that eventually, was comparable to the knowledge intensity that you have in other developed countries, but at a discount. So it's actually a story of knowledge intensity and knowledge complexity. So we have these three core macro laws of collective learning. The first law is this principle of improvement. The second law is the principle of relatedness. And the third law is the principle of knowledge intensity. But these are very aggregate. These are very coarse. So what I'm trying to do next in my group is actually going inside these principles to try to understand, well, what the heck this relatedness is. Okay? When I say, that the export of blouses is correlated to the export of shower curtains, well, is it because they both work with fabrics? Is it because they both sell to the same type of retailers? Is it because they require the same inputs, the same institutional environments, all of the above? So we're trying to look at those vectors because when we look at relatedness, on the one hand, we have the lack of being able to create measures of relatedness that are agnostic about what drives relatedness. But on the other hand, we have the problem that basically related activities can require many different things. This is what in Europe they would call a multiplex network. They love to say multiplex. So there's similar knowledge, similar input, similar infrastructure, institutions, similar customers, and so forth. And even within knowledge, you can start disaggregating. Well, what do you mean by having similar knowledge? Is it that people have worked in related industries or in similar occupations and so forth? So unpacking this is actually kind of complicated, but I think it's something that is extremely interesting. So luckily enough, we have been also creating tools that gather and integrate large amounts of data for entire countries. And one of these tools was DataViva. DataViva was a tool that we used that integrated all of the customs data, all of the social security data, and all of the education data of Brazil at the individual level. Okay? So we have individual level data for an entire country that we used to construct this resource for the Brazilian government, but that allowed us to understand the entire work history of this country. So this is not a sample. Okay? So what we have here is for every worker in Brazil, we know which industry they work in, what occupation they perform, and of course, what salary they got and many other things. So what we're going to do is we're going to abstract that work history as the knowledge history of a worker. I know what you know, not because you told me or not because you have been certified, but because you have done it in the past as part of your work. So I know that you have medical knowledge because you have worked as a doctor before. And I know that you have knowledge of accounting because you have worked as an accountant, and I know that you have knowledge of accounting in the context of the pipe fitting industry because you have worked as an accountant in the pipe fitting industry. So I'm going to take your work history as a measure of the knowledge that you have. So now this little worker, when the worker is the same color, it kept the same occupation. If the building kept the same color, it's in the same industry. Okay? So what we do here is we look at all pioneer firms. These are firms, that in Brazil entered economic activities that were not present in that location. So we have around 2,000 to 3,000 of these events. Okay? So let's say there was a location like Uberlandia that didn't have a software development industry before, and now we've observed for the first time that they have a software development firm. Now when we see that firm, that pioneer firm, we can actually see who exactly they hired and where they worked before. Did they work in the same location or did they move? Did they work in a related industry or in a different industry? Did they perform the same occupation or a different occupation? And of course we can say, well, this person can come from the same industry and same occupation, someone that moved and was already working on this industry and occupation someplace else, can come from the same industry but was performing a different occupation, so it changed kind of like jobs, different industry, same occupation, or different industry and occupation. Of course, this is very coarse, so we make it a continuum by using these measures of relatedness, and we can say, well, you can come from an unrelated occupation or from a related occupation, the most related being the exact same occupation. Okay? You can come from a related industry or from an unrelated industry, the more related industry being that you come from the same industry. And this is a matrix that shows you the decisions that people make. So this is for all of the firms that were pioneers, that are performing in an industry that was not present there, who do they hire? And you see that they don't hire people from related industries. Like this part here is kind of empty, Of course, there's a lot of slim pickings of picking people with unrelated knowledge and for both industries and occupation, but they do tend to hire relatively more people from related occupations than from related industries. So the matrix is more heavy to the top than heavy to the left. So basically, apparently, these firms, when they're hiring someone, they care what occupation this person had before, not what industry they worked in. So now, this is the decisions that people make. Now let's see what are the firms that survive. Okay? So this is the matrix of the firms that survive. So we look at the 3-year survival rate of these firms, and the ones that hire people from related industries, whether these people that come from a related occupation or from an unrelated occupation, are the ones that survive. When you hire people that perform the same occupation but come from an unrelated industry, that survival actually is much lower. And the size effects are relatively large. It's from 40% to 70% survival. Any entrepreneur, of course, would want to increase the survival of their small business from 40 to 70% if they had the chance. But the funny thing is that this is not what entrepreneurs are choosing. And also, if you think about it, it's not what our educational system is doing, because they're training us not to work at an industry, but they're training us to work on an occupation, assuming that you can move from an industry to another performing that same occupation. So I think there's something interesting here. Of course, the main message here is that actually those vectors of knowledge transfer are actually people. They appear to be these people that are moving from one industry to another, and when they bring the right type of knowledge, they increase the success of these firms. So this is not knowledge that is flowing, through papers or books or any of those things, but it's actually flowing embedded on the workers themselves. So I'm going to finish by showing you a little bit of the tools that we create to facilitate collective learning. We have created tools for the scale of teams, for the scales of organizations, for the scale of countries. For the sake of time, I'm going to focus only on the country-level tools. And these are tools that solve a recurring problem. This is a problem that affects public and private organizations, and is that these public and private organizations have to deal recurrently with multiple streams of data. So for example, if you would be a government, the transportation data is going to be in the Department of Transportation, the health data in the Department of Health. When it comes to the economy, your trade data is going to be in customs, maybe labor data is going to be at the Social Security Administration or the BLS, income data is going to be available in the tax authority, demographic data in the census, and so forth. And if you want to make decisions, you want to use all of that data, and you want to integrate it first, then you want to have a way to distribute it back to those data creators and to those analysts, and then you have a way to facilitate that analytical challenge. If you're a company, you have the same problem. One of the people that we're working on is Estée Lauder. They are a company that works on the cosmetics sector, and actually the problem is the same that a country would have. But in their case, it's data on inventory, data on sales, data on marketing, data on personnel. They all exist in very different systems. So that integration challenge actually is one of the big challenges that we need to solve. Now, what is the state of the art here? When we look at the open data sites that are out there that came out through this first wave of hype of open data, and the state of the art at this moment is filled with good intentions, okay? So let me give you 3 very quick examples. You go to the Argentina open data site, you search for income, you find a few data sets, you click on one of them, then you're gonna download an Excel file, that is gonna have a few numbers that are not linked to anything, So that's currently what we have right now. Then you go to the US, you say, of course, the US, much bigger, much better, much richer, But at the end of the day, the user experience that they provide is not different from the one that Argentina provides, So you're also going to go download the data, some incomplete cells there, and so forth, Now you say, well, if someone can figure this out, it's of course going to be the Swiss, And then you go to Switzerland and you search all the Switzerland open data site, and you go through this similar experience. And I'm sure that many of you have navigated these sites and you have become frustrated from them. So what we've done, to change the way that data is integrated, distributed, and visualized is think about data in a different way. We don't think of data as files. That's wrong, okay? So we think of data as elements into stories. So we don't think as a computer scientist, but we think as a writer. And when you think of data as elements into stories, you're going to be able to integrate the data seamlessly. Because when I'm a writer and I'm writing a story, and I'm using a fact from the BLS, or I'm using a fact from the census, or I'm using a fact from the Pew Research Center, in the story they're blended together in. So that's what we have done. We have created tools that help transform data into stories algorithmically, and that's how we integrate the data. So the first example, that is going to help us solve, the first one of these challenges is the Observatory of Economic Complexity. So nowadays, if you go to Google and you search for the exports of Argentina or any country, the first organic search link is a link to the OEC. Because the OEC is not trying to provide you a file with exports data. That's wrong. It's trying to transform that export data into a narrative that combines text and interactive visualizations that unpack that data and make it transparent to the search engines of the world. Okay? Because Google, remember, came out from a library school. It's hungry always for text. They love text. So you have a simple story here that has the text, has the visualizations, and then, since you know where you're at, you click on Brazil and immediately you say, hey, what does Brazil import from Argentina? That's a contingent follow-up question that allows you to go now to more complex visualizations. So also what we try to do is we try to minimize the amount of UI interactions that our users have to get to the information that they need. Because there's a lot of multiple drop-down menus that you have. So we start with the story, very simple, just a scroll interaction, and then with one click, you can go to other places. So the OEC is a project that actually we released in the year 2011. We make available international trade data for the entire world. But since then, we moved to Brazil. We did Data Viva, this integrated data from trade, labor, and education for all of Brazil. The OEC doesn't integrate data, but Data Viva already does. And then we moved to the US, and we created Data USA. Data USA integrates data from the American Community Survey, from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, from the University of Wisconsin County Health Records, from the Dartmouth Health Atlas, and many other sources into these interactive narratives that provide you the data, not how the government collects it, because that's another mistake. Nowadays, they deliver the data based on how they collect it. And you're not interested in how the data is collected. You're interested in what the data is about. Okay? So you want to say, hey, I want to know something about the software industry or about New York. Give me all that you've got. No, I don't care where it's coming from. And that's a little bit of what these tools are able to do. Then, we moved to Africa. We did Data Africa. This is the first transnational project that mixes data for 13 African countries at the subnational level. This is data on agriculture, health and poverty, for 13 African countries, And now we're also looking to expand to some of these other locations. We also went to the east, and we did this project with the government of Saudi Arabia, which actually look at the entire pension system data of Saudi Arabia and transform it into a dashboard that allows you, or these interactive stories that allow you to understand the labor economy of any location, industry, or occupation in the kingdom, because in the kingdom, one of the things that I'm very interested in is helping move people from the public sector to the private sector. The public sector is a big employer at the kingdom. Remember, they don't pay taxes, and people live out of the profits of the oil sector, but now they want to generate more entrepreneurship, and they need to know, well, what people know, where they're working at, what are the sectors that are growing, what are the salaries that are being paid. And that is information that, in principle, is hidden in the pension system data. In practice, without a tool like this, you would not be able to get that information at the tip of your fingers. And on January, we're releasing Data Chile. Data Chile is the most ambitious project that we've done in the context of integrating multiple data sources. It integrates more than 20 different departments, okay? So we integrate data from customs, from income, from employment, from innovation, from education, from migration, from insurances, and so forth. So these are large data integration and visualization projects. And they work differently because we have certain design principles. The idea is that if you go to the websites that I showed you before, it would be like shopping an IKEA, but shopping only in the first floor. So what they're asking you to do in that data.gov type of site is take out a file, open it by yourself, and start visualizing to figure out what's inside. That would be like going to IKEA and have to build every furniture before buying it. So what we do is we build the first and second floor of IKEA for our websites, because that second floor is that showroom that allows you to understand what's inside the data set. And the thing is that it works. So this is the Observatory of Economic Complexity. We launched in 2011. It came out in The Economist. And this is the blip that we got from press traffic. But since then, the traffic has been growing organically. So you see it goes down during the summer, and then it goes down again in Christmas. But overall, now we're at over 1 million monthly users, all from organic search. Okay, this is all organic search traffic, because basically by transforming data into stories, we have made this data accessible to the surface of the web, not hide it in the other formats. And is it just because we got lucky with the OEC? No, actually, when we did Data USA, we tried to engineer this again on purpose. And we did, So Data USA, when it came out, very popular, US media loved it. It was in the New York Times, it was the most shared news on the Atlantic, but you cannot live from referral traffic. So the traffic goes up, then it goes down, and then you go through a lull. But over time, that SEO starts picking up and picking up. So people don't come to Data USA by Googling Data USA. That would be naive. They come to Data USA because they say, median household income of Cook County. Boom. And then we're there. We're competing for that first spot in Google for many of those searches, because we unpack that data into stories that Google can now pick up. So we have basically tens of thousands of pages with dozens of sections each, competing for those first spots of all of those searches in Google. Actually, the census side had got a wind of this idea, so this is how their American Fact Finder looks now, this is how Data USA looks, and this is a design of their future census site that they shared with us, okay? So it's a little bit flattering. Now, the last thing I'm gonna show, and then I cut, is we haven't won the distribution challenge and the analytical challenge. I do have tools that solve both, but for the sake of time, I'm only going to show you the one that solves the distribution challenge. Because all of the tools that I show you so far integrate the data, but they don't allow you to distribute arbitrary personalized data sets back to the people. Yeah? How would you do that? Well, this year, on June, we launched a new version of Data USA that had a small but profound modification, which is the data card. So now you go to a map, let's say, and you search for data on population, and you want to merge it with other data sets. The only thing that you have to do is you say, add it to cart. Data USA is going to remember all that you have in the cart. So now you go to income and employment, poverty rate data, add it to cart. Maybe you don't just want to download data that is available in the maps. Maybe you want to get some data from some of the profiles. So you go here to the Cook County, Illinois profile, and maybe you're interested, on insurance coverage, because that's kind of like one of the things that you're interested on working on. So you find the data, you add it to cart, you find the hospital care data, you add it to cart, and then when you go to the cart, Data USA integrated all of that data for you. This is data that comes from multiple data sources, but now it's all matched. So no more Python script trying to wrestle, those, indexes or IDs, to merge. It's done as simple as online shopping. It was like 7 clicks to merge all of that data. Because the paradigm of these drop-down menus and selections is strictly, it's not right, but nevertheless, it's pervasive. So that's a little bit of what we've done. And we've done also like some of these things now with scholarly data. This is not as a professional product, that's the one that I showed before. No, this is Opus, but we've done all of the Google Scholar data set. And basically here you see me, you see Hiroshi, you see the publications that we have over time, you see our word clouds, you see also the curve of citations, but they compare us with all of the people that started publishing the same year that we did. And we give you also the social network of each one of these scholars, because of course, science is a collaborative effort that happens in that social context. And we can also compare institutions. For example, here you have MIT and Harvard. Harvard is much more based on medicine, MIT much more in computer science. And we can look at journals like Nature, Science, or we can look at countries as well. So my group is the collective learning group at the MIT Media Lab, but also DataWheel is not a pizzeria. It's actually a multinational software company by now that has executed projects in a variety of countries. And with that, I would like to thank you very much for your time, and I would be happy to take your questions. Thanks.